Hey, everybody, this is Mike Belcito, co-founder of Product Collective, and we're back for another industry interview session. Thank you very much for being here with us. I'm excited about this because I think this is a topic that it's just always on the mind of product people. We're always wanting to be data-driven, but are we doing the right things? I was just talking with our guest about that, and this is one of our most RSVP'd sessions. So I think all of you seem to be excited about the content as well and the topic at hand. So I want to get into it, but first, just a couple housekeeping things. If this is your first industry interview, welcome. We're glad to have you with us. I want to just kind of point out a couple of things first. We at Product Collective, we do these industry interviews. We also have our newsletter. We have an active Slack channel with a lot of product people. And we also put on a couple conferences every year called Industry. So that's what we do at Product Collective. These are particularly fun because we get to sit down with product leaders from really all over the world. In fact, our guest today is coming in from Israel. So that's a lot of fun. It's also a chance for you to get to interact with them. So you probably can see a couple of things. You could see chat, and you can see a section called Ask a Question. I would love it if you'd introduce yourself. Actually, now, if you could see and hear us okay, maybe you could say hi in the chat and just let us know where you're tuning in from and maybe what kind of product you're working on. That's always fun to see. But if you have questions for our guest today, I really want to direct you to the Ask a Question section. So that Ask a Question section, that's where you could submit a question, and I'll be checking up on that really throughout the entire interview. This will go until 1:30 Eastern, so it's about a half an hour. And I have questions teed up, but I love getting to bring in your questions. In fact, I'd rather bring in most of your questions. So be sure to list your questions there. Some folks ask if maybe they have to jump off, hey, is this going to be recorded? It will be. In fact, you could come right back to this URL right after the session, and you should be able to watch the recording. But we'll also follow up with an email, and I'll give you a link to that afterwards. So that's just a couple things to keep in mind about these sessions. And if you're new, again, if this is the first time, I definitely encourage you to sign up at productcollective.com so you can take advantage of all the resources. We can invite you to upcoming sessions like this. We've got some awesome ones coming up with Bob Mesta, co-architect of the Jobs to Be Done framework, with Scott Belsky, who actually just wrote a book a few months back called The Messy Middle, Deirdre Cower of the Skim. So there's a lot of these sessions that you could sign up for. We do these usually the first and third Wednesday of every month. So that is fun. And then again, you could check out industryconference.com, and you could keep tabs on what we're doing with industry. We have our European conference in April, and then we have our global edition where we'll probably have about 1,200 people with us in Cleveland in the fall. And that Jason Fried of Basecamp will be there. Grammy and Academy Award-winning artist Common will be there. And our guest is from Pendo. Pendo is our presenting sponsor for both of those conferences. So we're really grateful for that. And actually, speaking of Pendo, Product Collective, we collaborated with Pendo on something. Actually, we did it last year, and we're doing it again in 2019. We did a study with product leaders, and we put out this report, or about to put out this report next week, called The State of Product Leadership. And I'm going to be co-hosting a webinar with Jake from the product team, or from the Pendo team, on February 21st. And we're going to be going over our findings. There should be a little call to action button that'll lead you right to the webinar page. So if you want to check that out and listen in on the webinar that we have planned for that, that'd be great. Or if you sign up at Product Collective, I'll be emailing you next week when the report's out. So we'll definitely email you the report. We put together a nice ebook with Pendo on that. There's a lot of pretty insightful learnings on that. So definitely check that out too. But with all of that, now that we have sort of housekeeping out of the way, I want to get into the topic at hand, and that is metrics for product people. And to discuss that, we have Brian Croft, who's the Chief Product Officer at Pendo. And thanks a lot for joining us, Brian.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Well, I know that this is a topic, first of all, that you've written about in the past. I know this is something that you, sort of near and dear to your heart. And it is something that definitely is of interest to me, because I've found myself in the past as a product person where, again, people are leaning on me to be tracking things and we should be data driven. But again, it's just like, how do you know what to be tracking, or the things that we are tracking, are these the right things? And I guess just to start off our conversation, maybe I could just ask you, as product people, how can we figure out what the right metrics actually are? And maybe it depends on the types of businesses we have or the products we're managing, but maybe we could just start there.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. And again, thanks for having me on. I think this is a great topic of conversation. It's fun to see people from all over the world joining in, California, India, Seattle. So it's great to have all of you guys on board as well. And definitely I welcome questions. It looks like there's already a handful. So, there was actually already a question. I was looking while you were talking, and there was a question about, what kind of framework do you use to be able to know what you should measure and how you should measure it? And there's just a couple really simple ones that I like to follow. And really it's two, which is first and foremost, are you a B2B app or are you a B2C app? And there is some major distinctions between the two. If you're B2C, you're talking much more about a linear experience, so everything is about conversion funnels. It's about how do you optimize the perfect path, the path of least resistance, how do you reduce friction. And typically when you're B2C, the volume of data, the volume of users is much more significant. So you can get to statistical significance really quick and will change the way that you operate almost on a daily or weekly basis. The idea of experiments comes into play a lot. And so B2C is just fundamentally different than B2B. And so if you're B2B, you're thinking a lot more about retention and engagement and active use and sentiment. And because, for B2B, these are apps that they maybe rely on to do their job. And they, so how active they are, how engaged they are is really, really important. So I first, just really calling out there's a major difference between the two, and it's important to understand. And then second, the other framework, and you mentioned jobs to be done, this is another lens that we have as well, which is, first try to understand the job that you're trying to solve. So for example, if we're talking B2B and I'm trying to improve engagement, I need to understand certain metrics that are in engagement. And if I'm focused on sentiment, then I need a little bit more qual and quant. If I'm focusing on learning, how to improve onboarding, there's a certain set of metrics that I want to look and measure there. So that's the two frameworks. Number one, B2B versus B2C, and two, what questions do you have? What job are you trying to solve? And there's a series of metrics for each one of those.
That's awesome. And yeah, for those of you that aren't as familiar with jobs to be done, it's become so popular with product people, so probably everybody here is, but we do have that upcoming session with Bob Mesta, so that might be helpful to check out. Somebody did ask, and this would be one of them, like going through the whole jobs to be done process, but somebody had asked, are there exercises that you go through to try to figure out metrics? So that might be one of them. Are there other sort of exercises or sort of things that you're doing to try to get to a point where you're like, okay, this is an important metric for us to be tracking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the most important sort of tactics that I have with my team or with any team that I'm working with is just so number one, just understanding that sometimes when you say metrics and you need actionable metrics and you need to measure this, measure that, you need to be data driven. It can sometimes be overwhelming, and so the number one thing that I try to start with is just asking questions like, what are we curious about? For example, like, do we know the adoption of our product or our feature when we launch it? So for example, we spend, if you think about it, we spend tons of time and money and our most precious resource, which is engineering, all to build maybe a new feature or a new set of functionality. And then we don't know how to measure if it's successful or not, or we don't know, we wonder what the adoption would be, or what the adoption should be. And so I think just to keep it really simple, it's what questions do you have? What do you wonder about? And then I think this kind of maybe a higher level activity is really going through and being clear about what is the true benefit of your product, what's the value of your product, and then how do you measure things like speed to value or time to benefit. And then, after that, it's like, well, how do you actually measure you're achieving that benefit? And so I think, like there's a lot of good ways to get started. But that's the one that comes to mind, first and foremost, is just to like sit down with your team and brainstorm a bunch of questions. And then you can say, well, how do we go get these? Versus, I think, look, I'm in the world of building tools for product people and around analytics. And so obviously we want people to use these tools because they're super important. But like I always ask people to step back and just ask questions. And you don't need to think right now, is it a leading indicator? Is it lagging? Is it actionable? Is it not actionable? Just what questions do you have, and start there. And I find that to be the most helpful. And what's surprisingly is people have a lot of questions and they wonder about a lot of things. And the good thing is, in today's world versus when I started product management, it's really easy to answer these questions.
That's great. Yeah. And that does sound like that'd be certainly useful as a first step. I'm curious, once you at least have a hypothesis of, okay, these are the right metrics, like let's start tracking these. How widespread, within the organization should they be shared? I mean, I've been at some companies where I walk in the door and, there's a big screen and it's got all sorts of dashboard type things, which some might be company things, but some are actually product. Then I've been to some companies where, I've asked them about metrics and who else in the organization has them. They're like, oh, we can't share them with the marketing team. Like, we don't want the marketing team to know everything. Why don't you want the marketing team to know? So I'm just curious, like, as product people, how, should we be sharing these with the rest of the product org, broader than that? Like, where does it sort of, where does it go?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think just a couple of statements or thoughts. Number one is, as organizations, as departments, we need to be more transparent. Like, first and foremost, we need to be able to share what's working, what's not working well. And so if you're like worried about showing what's happening in your department, I think that's a bigger issue. It might be a cultural issue. It might be a personal issue. But number one, we've got to be transparent. We've got to share this stuff. And then I think, second is, I think one of the things that as product management is evolving and is becoming, as like we like to say, product is the new marketing. Like, we kind of owe and have a big responsibility, I think, within our organization to help educate the rest of the organization about what to measure and how important product measures are and how important it is to analyze all these different things that we'll talk about. And again, like, one of the things that I always struggle with is, sales, marketing, that's something that's been going on for a long time. And so we know how to measure those, we know the questions to ask, but we don't on product. And sometimes us as product people, we don't know what to ask. And so if you are measuring, and whether it's good or bad, if you are measuring it, it's really important to share. And as you said in the beginning, like, it's hard to improve something you don't measure. And so it's just a best practice that to share and to be open and to get it on your Looker dashboards or whatever your company uses, to go over metrics. Like, have it on there, take a seat at the table in terms of metrics, and start to continue to show the value that product management is to the organization. And we can't just be this organization that says, you don't get it. There's a lot of things that happen. We're working with engineering, we're doing it's hard to measure. And we just need to move, like, if we really want to establish ourselves as a legitimate function, which again, we have been over the years, like, we need to bring metrics and we need to run our department like the rest of the business does. And so I'm super passionate about that, of course. But yeah, I think there's an education aspect, and then there's a doing aspect, and we need to see more of it.
That's great. And by the way, just a reminder, everybody, I have several more questions here, but keep loading up that ask a question section, because I definitely want to get to more of your questions. For one of mine though, right now, you mentioned before, the comment, you can't improve what you aren't measuring, right? So, part of us tracking these metrics is to figure out a gauge of whether things are working. And if things aren't working, you want to improve at it. What's your take on, improving at things that we see that are starting to not work versus I also don't want to overreact. I don't want to see like, oh man, an indicator's showing that this is going down. How do you know when to act on something versus not overreact?
Yeah. Well, I think, kind of going back to some of the earlier threads, like number one, like I don't think we're yet in jeopardy of overreacting. Like I think it's first like, let's act, and if we start to get to that place where we're overreacting, we can correct ourselves. Now, what I think you might be referring to is if there's some kind of false positive or some indicator that it's successful or something's working, but it's really not, like anything like that, that obviously can lend itself to overreaction. But if we can just start acting more and even start to cross that line of overreacting, I think I'm totally cool with that. But I think, it goes back to some of the fundamentals that we were talking about, which is, what are the questions that you have as you start to answer them and start to pull together data, that then leads to more questions, and you start to go on this path and you start to get more curious and ask more questions, and you start to find yourself in a place where maybe you don't know what to do at that point. But I think, one of the tactics that we've used is, whatever metric we might be looking into or following, one test that we always do or quick brainstorm is, let's come up with 5 or 6 things that we can do right now today to try to improve this. And so just like anything, we're, as product people, we're super comfortable brainstorming and coming up with those next steps. And for me, like the best thing is, as like a product leader working with product managers, the best thing that I see, like when I kind of dub you as like an amazing product manager, is when you come to me and say, all right, we had this goal for this feature launch. We launched the product, and what we've noticed is this segment adopted it more than this segment, but overall we're lower than what we anticipated. And so what I did is I reached out and engaged with the customers, whether it's in app or outside of app, and I asked a precise question based on some unusual behavior that I saw from certain individuals or certain users. And then once I got back that feedback, I was able to come up with a few hypotheses, and now I'm ready to run an experiment. Or I just ran an experiment, and it turns out that the reason why they're not doing XYZ is because they don't understand this. And so all of a sudden you have a product manager that really understands that the goal is not just to launch new features. The goal is to add value. And so when we see that adoption isn't what we hoped it was, or maybe what it historically has been, we then go on this path of figuring out the why. And then once we understand the why, it's now we can do something about it, something that's actionable. And for me, that's like music to my ears, where people understand their core job, which is to build stuff that creates more value to the user for whatever industry or whatever product you're in. And so it's not just you're not at that place where you don't know what to measure. You're not at that place of you've measured it, but now what? You're in that really great place where you have insights, you have a bunch of ideas of how to act on it based on hypotheses, and then you're really managing a product. That's what it's all about. And I think, too often we do PM, but we don't know what's happening after that. Or we launch features and we get stuff shipped, and then we move on to the next thing. And that's obviously what we're missing a big part if we're not measuring.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I have a couple awesome audience questions that are coming in, so I want to go to a couple of those. One of them has to do with metrics, not so much on our product. We talked about kind of some product health metrics, how we get there, but product team metrics. The question was, if you are, or what kind of metrics should you use when you're actually developing the product? Should we be tracking things like, how often we're taking things off of our backlog, or, I've in the past, worked with a CTO where, he's really concentrating on like the efficiency of the team. Like, what's your take on those kind of metrics?
Yeah. So a couple of things, like, and actually I haven't done it for a couple of quarters, so it reminds me I need to do it. But there's a couple of things that come top of mind. One, just the product team in itself. And so I have a handful of questions that I survey my team, and it's really about, do they understand the job, or the what they're trying to solve? Do they understand that? Number two is mostly about, do they feel like they're able to, leverage their skills to be able to accomplish that? Do they feel like what they're doing ties to the bigger goal? So that allows the bigger company goal or whatever, vision or mission. And so that allows me to assess, like, are we aligned? Like, are we headed in the right direction? That's just a pure like engagement. So that's always great to check in on. We also, like in my team right now, every week at the end of the week, you kind of do a recap of how the week went, what you accomplished, what went well, and just an overall happiness score. Like, how happy are you? How good do you feel? And so that's just data that I get on a weekly basis. And so, if I know somebody's consistently, 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5, and all of a sudden they're at 2, I know how that's a great data point for that. I can go react on that. Now, it's a bit of a lagging thing, but because we do it every week, I have a really good sense of kind of the happiness of the team, and do they feel engaged? And so I think about like quarterly surveys, weekly survey, whatever you can do to get the pulse. But of course, that's just qualitative data, and we know data itself isn't as good as when you combine it with just talking to your people, making sure that everything is going okay, and having those face-to-face one-on-ones. Now, that's kind of just the pure, like, this is the product team. I'm getting data. I'm trying to learn how we get better at XYZ, how they're engaged, but how engaged are they? But when you think about the overall product team, the product and engineering team, in terms of metrics, like, if you don't know, like, each of your, say, call it feature teams, if you don't know their velocity or what they can achieve, sprint to sprint, and then you're not measuring, okay, if this is our velocity, this is what we can hit in terms of a sprint, and then you're not measuring whether or not they hit that velocity or hit that commitment, then that's bad. Like, you need to absolutely understand the throughput and the output and the velocity of your product and engineering organization. So, what we do is, for every feature team or every Scrum team, every 2 weeks, we look at those metrics and see if teams have accomplished their commitments, if they've hit their velocity or not. And so we measure that religiously. In fact, it's part of our health dashboard for the company. So as a company, they see if these Scrum teams are actually hitting their commitments, if they're hitting their velocity. And that's super important, because then that, of course, is a leading indicator of if we're going to hit our commitments for the quarter or for some big feature release. And that then enables the non-product, the non-engineering people to say, hey, wait a minute, you've kind of been showing you're off track for a few sprints now. Are we worried about this launch that's tying with this marketing campaign? So absolutely, we need metrics to be, just like any team. It can't be some black box. We need to be able to measure the efficiency, effectiveness of our product and engineering team. So yeah, fundamental. If you're not doing it, start doing it today. Start understanding your team's velocity. Start understanding their output. Start putting goals. Start measuring it, and make it visible. Make people accountable. There is, somebody said something to me the other day, which is like, well, how do I hold my engineers accountable? Like, they're so protected, right? They're the most precious resource, and there's almost a negative unemployment rate with engineers. And I'm like, well, apply social pressure. Like let everybody see, how they're doing against their commitments, and it'll change. And whether you're in demand or not, you want to hit your commitments. That social pressure is super important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, for sure. This is another audience question, and it's definitely the most upvoted question so far. And this is one that's always on my mind. How do you distinguish the important actionable metrics that, again, might vary from business to business, but versus the vanity metrics. There's probably metrics that we could easily track and show people, but really they're not as meaningful. How do you sort of distinguish those?
Yeah, I totally get the question, and I've always struggled with kind of what's the confusion on this one. Not to alienate any of the people that asked the question, but to me, it's a very simple test, right? Like, is it actionable or is it not, right? Like, can you and your team? So, for example, if you are looking at, let's say, call a vanity metric a number of visitors, and you're looking at that number of visitors and you see that it's growing, it's going up. Well, okay, what do you do about that? Now, hopefully it's going up and not going down or whatever, but like, is that, if you sat in a room with other product managers, other business leaders, and you said, what can we do to get this number up from a product perspective? Like, what are you going to do? Like, now, something like that's similar to that, which is monthly active users. So kind of that DAO-MAU ratio of daily active users over monthly active users, that starts to kind of move towards that realm of actionable, because I could say, well, look, our goal is to take DAO-MAU from 25% up to 50%. And so what you're talking about is, how do I make my product more engaging on a daily basis? How do I create, let's say, more transactional value in my product versus I need to just come in once a month to do this job and leave? Again, it depends on what you're trying to solve, but all of a sudden, even something like DAO-MAU becomes super, it becomes super actionable, right? And you can brainstorm a bunch of ideas of how do you increase daily active use for a B2B product, for example.
Yeah, it almost sounds like, it's like, first, when you have a metric, sort of challenge yourself. When I look at this metric, do I automatically know, is this positive or negative? And if you're looking at something and it's hard to answer that question, that might not be that useful of a metric, maybe. At least maybe that's one thing to do.
Yeah, and somebody here on the thread, looks like Barry said, vanity metrics, does it solve a customer need? Like, I think it's a great question, and it kind of goes back to, as you pointed out, like the jobs to be done. Like, for all of the products that you guys are managing, what is the core value that you're bringing to your customer? Why are they hiring your product? Again, job to be done language. But at the end of the day, if you can't figure out how to tie it back to that, then you just kind of got to go back to the whiteboard. So, I think, look, it's, vanity, like, look, in our product, in our dashboard, we have vanity metrics, right? I don't think vanity metrics are bad. Let's just call them what they are. And again, the litmus test is get a bunch of smart people in the room and brainstorm what you can do about how to improve this metric.
Yeah. Well, we have pretty much time for one last question. Time's kind of flown by, but I want to kind of combine a couple things here, because this question sort of came up in the ask a question section too. But there are some companies, I would say there are rarely companies, right? It doesn't happen as often, where, like Pendo, where your CEO, Todd's a product person. Like, he came from the product world, like he gets product. I have definitely come into contact with some companies where the executive is not a product person. So their idea of tracking metrics might be, to you, might be a vanity metric, or might be they're tracking things that are important to the business, revenue, profitability. How can we help for the companies where the executives might not be tracking the product metrics, and that might traditionally has been important to them? How can we help our executives understand the importance of real, true product metrics? Yeah, no,
it's a really great question. And, I think, to me, it's kind of a two-part answer. Number one is, we have one really good thing going for us, which is this idea, which is a broader topic in and of itself, that product is becoming the new marketing. Meaning, at the end of the day, we live in a don't tell me industry or world. We live in a show me. And so we have, whether it's B2C apps, B2B apps, we show people, we tell people, they see these apps that change our lives, and we talk about them. And that's the number one way to drive business. That is the number one metric, is word of mouth. And so there's really no number two after that. Like, it's all about word of mouth. And so, what CEOs or business leaders of these products, these digital products, if they don't understand that, then at some point something's going to happen, whether they're either disrupted or they're outperformed by somebody else. I mean, that's fundamental. And I think that's becoming more and more understood. So that we have all of that going for us, which is more CEOs, I think, are going to be asking, gosh, we need to measure product. Product is way more important than I thought it used to be, or whatever it is. So we have that kind of macro thing happening. And then I think in terms of what can individuals do, I think it kind of goes back to the first part of that conversation, which is part of it is we need to educate. One of the things that I did at my last startup, where we were dealing with a CEO that was, we'll call it less product savvy in terms of metrics, in terms of technology. And I just walked into an executive meeting. I had 15 minutes to do an update. And I said, we're going to do, we're going to go through, and I'm going to kind of talk about some myth busters in the business and the product. And I'm going to kind of put a myth out there, like, this type of customer doesn't use our product, or only this type of person uses the product, or nobody uses this part of the product. And then you either prove that to be right, or you myth bust it. And all of a sudden you kind of start going down this path of like, wow, these metrics or these insights are like, I want to go do something about that. And all of a sudden you're starting to change the culture of, going from only sales numbers or marketing numbers actionable to, wow, this product metric data, whatever, is super, it's helpful, and it's actually driving action and driving powerful conversation. Like, why is our engagement, why is DAO MAU so low, or why is engagement low, or why is our NPS so low? And then you can take initiative. So I think about something like that. Take all the myths or the things that are being talked about your product and put it to the test and do some myth busting. And I see it as, it's fun exercise, but it's also that education that we talked about. And then it shows that you're really trying to evolve and take your company to the next level by being data driven, just like sales, marketing, and all the other departments are.
That's great. I love that. I think that's an awesome sort of exercise. We could all run our own Mythbusters games with our executives. Yeah, I think that's great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're past the time that we had with you. First of all, I just want to say thank you for being here, and thanks to everybody for being here. But Brian, I know that other people have questions that maybe I didn't get to. There might be more that pop up. How can people keep tabs on you? I know you do some writing. You're on Twitter and other forms of social media. Can you maybe just let people know how they could keep tabs on you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you can follow me on Twitter at Brian Crofts. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn, like any of the mediums these days. And we were talking about before, like I would also love, if you have questions, hit me up. But if you also disagree, if you disagree with some of I would love that debate, that conversation, because I think that's how we're all in this together. We're all trying to rise the tide of product management and how we run our departments and how we influence the world and the business. And so I love the debate, the discussion. So hit me up on LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever. I'd love to engage. So
awesome. Well, thanks again, Brian. Thanks everybody for being here, and we'll see everybody in 2 weeks where we have a session coming up with Scott Belsky. So I'll see y'all then.